The sun was setting over the dusty plantation fields, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly, swallowing men and women alike into a world that offered no mercy. In the heart of the South, the air was thick with heat, sweat, and the quiet hum of unseen suffering. Among the rows of cotton, bending under the weight of both the crop and their own humanity, moved a figure so unremarkable, so silent, that many forgot he even existed. His name was Silas, but the masters called him a shadow, a tool, nothing more. Yet behind his quiet gaze, there was a storm, a fire that no whip could ever touch. The people around him laughed, barked orders, and sometimes even beat him, thinking that silence meant submission. But in that silence, Silas was listening. Every word that carried cruelty, every glance that carried desire, every hand that reached to control him was being remembered. Each master who crossed him, each injustice, etched a mark in his mind. And in the stillness of his quiet, a plan began to take shape, not of escape, not of rebellion in the open, but a plan as precise and as cold as the steel he would one day wield. But before we continue this story, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who loves hidden stories. It helps bring more of these untold truths to light. Silas was born into bondage in the early 1800s, in a small, sprawling estate in the South. His earliest memories were of wood smoke and sorrow, of women weeping in the kitchens, and men breaking under the relentless sun. Slavery was not merely a labor system, it was a mechanism of erasure. It sought to strip men and women of their names, their voices, their dignity. But even in a world that demanded silence, there were those who refused to disappear. Silas was one of them. Though the masters believed he was nothing more than obedient flesh, his mind was a fortress. Each command he followed, each punishment he endured, was not compliance but patience. By the age of 12, Silas had already been moved through 3 different households. He learned quickly which tasks drew attention, which words angered, and which silences protected him. His small body was strong, wiry from labor, yet it was his mind that was strongest. The masters saw only muscle. They never saw calculation. They never saw the sharpness that lurked in the corners of his eyes, or the way he could stand among them like a statue, yet feel the pulse of fear in their veins. It was in the 5th household, owned by a man named Thomas Whitaker, that Silas's understanding of power and cruelty deepened. Whitaker was a man of charm and menace, his smiles laced with threat. He took particular interest in Silas, not as a human being, but as an object of possession, a thing to be broken, molded, and used. Whitaker's advances were subtle at first, a touch on the shoulder, a hand on the boy's back. When Silas recoiled, the punishments began. Whippings left scars, yes, but deeper still were the bruises on his spirit, the quiet humiliation that none but the wind witnessed. By the time Silas turned 16, he had endured the hands of 8 masters in total. Each one brought a new horror, a new lesson in cruelty. Some were brutish, wielding chains and paddles. Others were subtle, wielding psychological terror that gnawed at the soul. Yet all of them underestimated the boy who bore their assaults with the quiet resilience of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. The turning point came on a night thick with humidity, when the cicadas screamed like 1,000 small knives. Silas had been sent to the Whitaker quarters to fetch candles, and there, in the dim glow of the flickering flames, he endured the worst of Thomas's cruelty. Thomas approached, hands lingering too long, his voice a soft venom. Silas felt the familiar surge of fear, but also something new, clarity. This fear, this indignity would not own him. Not anymore. Over the following months, Silas began to act with a patience that seemed almost supernatural. He watched his masters, memorizing their routines, noting the times when doors creaked, when guards were distracted, when the sun hung just right in the sky to cast shadows over his actions. Every cruel word, every violent lash, every invasive touch was stored like coins in a secret purse. He learned the architecture of the estates, the weaknesses of men who thought themselves gods. And most importantly, he learned that silence could be a weapon as sharp as any knife. The first act of defiance was small, a tool misplaced here, a chain left loose there. But to Silas, it was monumental. It was proof that even in invisibility, he could exert power. Soon his defiance escalated to something darker, more deliberate. By his 18th year, Silas had resolved that those who took from him without consent who violated his body and spirit, would pay a price no master had ever imagined. And he would do it silently, invisibly, leaving the world believing he was still just a shadow among the fields. Silas's transformation was not sudden. It was a slow burning of intellect and will. He became meticulous, observing every nuance of his master's behaviors. He noticed the arrogance in their walk, the trembling in their hands when confronted by illness, the fear that flickered in their eyes at whispers of rumors. These observations became tools, each one a small step toward a reckoning that would one day shatter the lives of 8 men who thought they were untouchable. And then, the first opportunity presented itself. A master named Benjamin Crawley, a cruel man with a taste for domination, had grown careless. His nights were long, his temper short, and his trust in Silas absolute. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the estate lay in slumber, Silas acted. The deed was precise, controlled, and horrifying to behold. A calculated act that ensured Crawley would never harm another soul in the same way again. The shadows swallowed him as completely as the world had swallowed Silas for years, but unlike the darkness of his past, this night carried purpose, justice, and the cold satisfaction of vengeance. Word of Crawley's sudden incapacity spread slowly, as whispered rumors in the kitchens and corridors, but no one suspected Silas. He remained the quiet boy, the shadow, the obedient servant. Yet within him, a sense of empowerment bloomed like a hidden flower, nourished by years of suffering and sharpened by the inevitability of retribution. Silas understood now that silence could be deafening, and patience could be lethal, and so the pattern was set. 8 masters, each guilty of unspeakable acts, each blinded by arrogance, would learn the cost of underestimating the one they had treated as nothing. Silas the Silent had begun a journey that no one, not even the most cunning slaveholders, could foresee. Each act of vengeance would be precise, deliberate, and devastating. And all the while, the world around him would remain oblivious, unaware that in their midst walked a storm, calm yet deadly, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The dawn after Benjamin Crawley's ruin was eerily calm. The plantation stirred with confused whispers. Crawley lay in his bed, pale and trembling, unable to speak, the look in his eyes that of a man who had glimpsed something far worse than death. The doctor's carriage came rolling through the dirt road by midday, but no medicine could restore what had been taken. His wife wept behind closed doors, his overseers muttered about punishment, and the slaves worked in frightened silence. Yet in the midst of that silence moved Silas, quiet, unassuming, carrying buckets of water, eyes cast down as though nothing had changed. But within him, something had changed. For the first time, he felt control. Not freedom, never that, but a strange, private kind of power. The same hands that had been shackled now carried out a justice unseen. His silence was no longer a mark of submission. It had become his cloak, his disguise, his weapon. Weeks turned to months. Crawley, broken in both body and spirit, sold off his estate, retreating into obscurity. Silas was sold once again, this time to a man named Colonel Harlan Pike, a veteran of the war, known for his brutality and his fondness for discipline. Pike prided himself on breaking men, and he believed that every slave could be molded with the right mixture of pain and terror. Silas was placed among the field hands. The days were longer, the work harsher, and the whips sang like cruel music in the air. Pike's overseer, a thick-necked brute named Latham, enforced order with a kind of joyless precision. He saw in Silas the same thing every master did: obedience. Latham mistook silence for fear. But Silas was studying again, watching, waiting. The colonel's mansion was built on a rise overlooking the river, a grand decaying house whose white pillars gleamed like bones. Inside, luxury and rot mixed freely, velvet curtains and the smell of sweat, fine silverware and the echoes of screams. Pike often held gatherings where wealthy planters drank bourbon and shared stories of their property, laughing like men who believed themselves eternal. Silas was often present, refilling glasses, carrying trays, unseen yet seeing everything. He watched how Pike moved, how he drank, how his laughter changed with drink. He memorized which keys hung from his belt, which doors creaked, which windows stayed open at night. Silas never rushed. Revenge, he knew, was not a moment. It was an art form. One evening, after a storm rolled through, Pike summoned Silas to his study. The floor was slick with rainwater, candles trembling in their holders. Pike was in one of his moods, half drunk, half nostalgic. He spoke of his past, of the war, of the men he'd killed, and the discipline that built empires. He rambled on about loyalty and obedience. Then, like so many before him, his voice took on that tone, the tone Silas knew too well. When Pike reached out, Silas froze, not in fear, but in calculation. He knew what would come next. He'd seen it before. The hands, the soft command, the sense of ownership. And as Pike leaned closer, Silas's eyes shifted to the heavy candlestick on the desk. Iron, thick, and perfectly balanced. That night, thunder drowned the sound of retribution. When dawn came, Colonel Pike's study was locked. The servants found him at sunrise, slumped in his chair, breathing but broken in a way that no doctor could fix. The details were hushed immediately. The overseer Latham called it an accident, though he could not explain how such a thing could happen. The slaves spoke in whispers. The women looked at Silas differently now, not as a fellow sufferer, but as something more. Some saw in him a ghost, others a savior, but Silas himself felt nothing. No joy, no triumph, only the same heavy silence that had followed him all his life. His vengeance was not born from hatred, but from something deeper, a need for balance in a world that knew none. After Pike's accident, the estate was sold off in parts. Silas was sent again, traded like cattle, this time to a smaller plantation owned by a man named Elijah Tuttle, a preacher who believed himself righteous. He spoke of God as though he were his confidant, preaching mercy in church and cruelty at home. His sermons were full of fire, his punishments swift. He told Silas that obedience was divine, that silence was holy. To Elijah, every lash he struck was God's correction. Silas listened, as always. The irony was bitter on his tongue. In those days, the South was full of men like Tuttle, pious on Sunday, monstrous by Monday. Silas learned the rhythms of his new life quickly. He woke before dawn, tended the horses, and worked the fields. At night he slept in a small dirt-floored shed behind the main house. But even in this new hell, his mind stayed sharp. Elijah's hypocrisy was endless. He forced prayers before meals and inflicted punishments after. He quoted scripture as he ordered whippings. And at night his footsteps echoed down the hallway toward the slave quarters, toward the same cruelty that had repeated itself through Silas's life. This time, however, Silas did not simply endure. He began to craft something, small, delicate, precise. From scraps of metal stolen from the blacksmith's shed, he shaped a tool, a weapon silent and sharp. He buried it beneath his bed of straw, waiting. The opportunity came when Elijah decided to discipline a young girl, barely 15, who had dropped a plate during dinner. Silas saw the terror in her eyes, the trembling of her small hands, and something inside him, something that had been smoldering for years, finally ignited into rage. That night, as Elijah entered the quarters, candlelight flickering against the walls, Silas stepped from the shadows. The preacher's sermon ended mid-word. What happened next was swift, silent, and absolute. When morning came, Elijah was alive, but his power was gone, permanently. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said the preacher had been attacked by demons. Others whispered that God himself had punished him for hypocrisy. But in the shadows, Silas remained the same, quiet, obedient, expressionless. No one suspected the silent man with the calm eyes. Over the years that followed, Silas would move through more masters, 5 in total, each one bearing the same cruelty, the same entitlement, and each one, eventually, brought to ruin by unseen hands. His legend began to form, though no one spoke his name. Among the slaves, whispers grew of a spirit of vengeance that moved from plantation to plantation. They called him the Silent One. By the time Silas reached his 7th master, he had become more myth than man. He'd learned how to vanish into the crowd, how to make every act look like chance. He poisoned no one, murdered no one outright, yet every man who took from him what was not his to take lost something that made them less than whole, and yet, for all his precision, all his patience, there was a loneliness that clung to Silas like shadow. Every act of vengeance deepened his isolation. He had become a ghost long before death could claim him. In the faces of other slaves, he saw fear where he'd hoped to see understanding. In the eyes of the masters, he saw the same arrogance that had always ruled the world. Nothing changed. He began to wonder if justice in a world built on chains could ever truly exist. The final master came when Silas was nearly 40. His body bore the scars of decades, but his spirit was unbroken. The man's name was Richard Hale, a wealthy trader, charming and ruthless, whose fortune came not just from plantations, but from the buying and selling of men. Hale was younger than most, smooth-tongued, educated. He fancied himself enlightened, spoke kindly, dressed well, and believed that humane ownership made him better than others. But beneath that veneer of civility, Silas saw the same darkness. For a while, he served quietly, blending into Hale's grand estate by the river. He had seen it all before: the laughter, the cruelty wrapped in politeness, the lies told to the world. But Hale was different in one way. He kept a journal, a leather-bound book filled with careful handwriting and private confessions. And in those pages, Silas discovered the truth. Hale's charm hid horrors even the others hadn't dared. The journal spoke of experiments, of men mutilated for study, of women broken for endurance. For the first time in years, Silas felt fear, not for himself, but for what the world would become if men like Hale were allowed to live unchecked. He waited for months, studying Hale's every habit, every secret. When the time came, it was not out of vengeance alone, but out of grim necessity. The act was deliberate, surgical, and final. When the estate awoke the next morning, Richard Hale was found alive, but changed forever. His journal was gone, and the slaves who had once feared his cruelty began to whisper prayers of thanks. They did not know who had done it. Some said it was God's wrath. Others said it was the work of a demon in human skin. Silas left that night, walking alone into the darkness. No chains, no master, just the sound of crickets and the long road ahead. He disappeared into history as quietly as he had lived. Some said he fled north, others claimed he was caught and hanged. But among those who remembered, his legend endured, a whisper, a ghost story, a symbol of silent retribution. In the fields where he once labored, the wind still carries his name, Silas the Silent. When Silas vanished into the darkness, the south exhaled, a deep, uneasy breath that trembled through its fields and wooden shacks. No one knew where he'd gone. Some said he drowned crossing a river. Others whispered that he'd walked straight into the swamps, swallowed by mist and memory. Yet for every man who believed he was dead, there were 10 who swore they'd seen him still, a shadow moving through the trees, a pair of eyes in the moonlight, a presence that made cruel men shiver without knowing why. It began as a whisper among the enslaved. He walked still. On quiet nights, when the air grew thick with humidity and fear, the field hands would murmur stories of the Silent One, the man who couldn't be broken, the spirit who punished the wicked. Mothers told their children that when the overseer grew cruel, Silas was watching. Men chained in barns told each other that when the whip cracked, it would not go unanswered forever. His name became not just a man's name, but a prayer. In the South of the 1830s, where fear ruled more than law, even whispers had power. Plantation owners began to notice the change. The slaves moved with a strange, quiet confidence. Their eyes no longer dropped quite as quickly. Some nights, songs carried through the fields, soft spirituals that spoke not only of deliverance in heaven, but of justice on earth. He sees the wicked, but he makes no sound, one verse went. The night will come, and they will be found. It was said that on one plantation in Georgia, a master woke to find a single symbol carved into his door, a circle with a slash through the middle. No one knew what it meant, but every slave on that property smiled when they saw it. Soon the symbol spread, scratched into barn walls, etched into trees, burned into wooden fences. Wherever it appeared, cruelty seemed to falter for a time. Overseers hesitated, masters grew paranoid, and rumors deepened the fear. For years, Silas existed in that space between man and myth, a haunting. Some said he traveled north to freedom. Others believed he moved from plantation to plantation, avenging those who could not speak for themselves. The truth was simpler and sadder. No one knew. Yet that unknowing made his story powerful. By the time word of uprisings and abolition reached the deeper South, Silas had become a symbol even the North began to hear about. Abolitionist writers in Boston and Philadelphia, hungry for stories that revealed the rot beneath America's promise, began to print tales of the phantom slave. In secret newspapers, his legend grew, a man who had struck fear into the heart of tyranny and vanished before he could be caught. Slaveholders called him a devil. Abolitionists called him an angel of retribution. But among those who had once been enslaved, he was something holier, proof that even the smallest voice, even silence itself, could thunder against oppression. Years passed, and the world began to change. The 1840s brought whispers of rebellion, of underground routes to freedom, of coded songs sung by moonlight. Those who fled north carried with them not just stories but symbols. In one small abolitionist settlement near Cincinnati, an escaped man named Josiah claimed to have traveled for weeks guided by a sign carved into trees, that same circle and slash. When he finally arrived safely, he told the others, "Silas led me." Whether it was true or not didn't matter. What mattered was that hope had found a name. As the Civil War loomed, Silas's legend resurfaced in new forms. Union soldiers spoke of freed men who refused to run from the fight, men who painted strange symbols on their rifles or carved them into their belts. When asked why, they'd smile faintly and say, "It's for him, the one who kept his silence." The war tore the country apart, and with it, the old world of the plantations began to crumble. Mansions burned, fields went fallow, and the songs of the enslaved became songs of freedom. Yet even in that chaos, the story of Silas lived. One Union soldier, a black man named Corporal Isaiah Grant, wrote in a letter home, "When we marched through Georgia, we came upon a house abandoned by its master. On the wall, scratched into the plaster, was a single mark, that circle, the line through it. The others said it was just a mark of looters, but I knew better. I touched it and felt something, as if a man who'd once been silent had spoken through time to tell us, 'You've come far enough.' Finish what I began. When the war finally ended in 1865, the South lay broken. The chains had been struck off by law, though not by hatred. Freedom had come, but at a terrible price. In the years that followed, freed men and women built churches, schools, and new lives out of the ashes. Yet among the older ones, the ones who remembered the darkest nights, Silas's name lingered like smoke. Some claimed they'd known him. Others said they were taught by those who had. One old woman in Louisiana told her grandchildren, "He never left. The earth took him in and the ground remembers his steps." Even decades later, during Reconstruction, when the South tried to bury its sins beneath new laws, the story of Silas the Silent endured in whispers and folklore. The newly freed told it in secret gatherings. Preachers wove his name into sermons about justice. He became the nameless man in the night who righted wrongs, the unseen hand of divine vengeance. And as the century turned, his myth adapted to the times. In the 1890s, when Jim Crow rose like a new chain, black communities passed down a phrase, "Walk like Silas." It meant move quietly, but never stop moving. To walk like Silas was to endure with purpose, to resist without always speaking, to survive with dignity in a world built to erase you. Writers began to collect the stories. In 1902, an African-American historian named Ruth Templeton published Whispers of the Silent, a collection of oral tales she'd gathered from former slaves. In her introduction, she wrote, "Silas may never have existed as one man, but he exists in every man who bore injustice in silence and dreamed of reckoning. Whether spirit or symbol, he walks still, not for vengeance, but for remembrance." By the time the Harlem Renaissance dawned, artists and poets revived him once more, no longer as a figure of violence, but of transformation. Painters depicted him as a faceless silhouette in fields of gold, rising from the soil. Poets wrote of him as the quiet thunder, the soul of a people who endured. Even now, in the 21st century, historians still debate whether Silas was ever real, whether there was a man who vanished from the records, leaving behind only rumor and myth. Some point to archived ledgers that list a Silas male, Negro, age 40, sold 1832, a line with no follow-up entry. Others find the circle and slash symbol carved on the beams of barns that have long since collapsed. But the truth, as always, may be less about one man and more about what he represented. Silas the Silent became the story of those who had no voice, a reflection of countless nameless men and women who endured the unendurable. who found ways to resist when rebellion seemed impossible. His legend, like the songs sung in the dark, carried meaning deeper than words. Today, when historians walk the old fields, when they see the scars left by time, the cracked stones, the broken chains, the overgrown graves, they sometimes speak his name aloud, not as myth, but as memory. Because whether or not Silas ever truly existed, his story did. It lived in whispers, in songs, in every act of quiet resistance that shaped history. And perhaps that was his truest vengeance, not the pain he dealt to the wicked, but the courage he gave to the broken, even now. When the wind moves through the southern fields at dusk, some say you can still hear it, the sound of silence that is not empty, but full of everything he left behind. The sound of a man who refused to die forgotten. The sound of justice, spoken without words. The sound of Silas the Silent. Decades rolled over the South like slow-moving thunder. The old plantations decayed, their white columns cracked and tilting under the weight of history. Vines crept up the walls, swallowing what had once been monuments to cruelty. Time eroded the buildings, but not the stories, not the whispers. In the sharecropper cabins that replaced the slave quarters, children still heard his name before they learned to read. "Don't fear the night," their elders would say. The night walks with Silas. By the early 1900s, the South was different in name, but not in heart. Slavery had ended, yet chains still clinked, made of poverty, fear, and laws that wrote oppression in elegant ink. The fields were the same, the labor the same, only the language had changed. The masters were now employers, the slaves workers. But the air carried memory, and memory, like silence, was powerful. It was in 1912, in a small town near Jackson, Mississippi, that Silas's name was spoken in public again, not as a whisper, but as defiance. A man named Aaron Griggs, a descendant of slaves, had been accused of stealing from the storehouse where he worked. He faced a mob of white men in the courthouse yard, their anger sharpened by generations of hate. As they surrounded him, he stood straight and said only 6 words. "I walk like Silas the Silent." Those who were there would remember it for the rest of their lives. The crowd hesitated, not because they understood, but because of the way he said it. Calm, steady, unflinching. Something in his voice made even rage falter. Aaron was beaten that day, but not broken, and from that moment on, "Walk like Silas" became more than a phrase. It became a quiet movement. In the 1920s, when the Great Migration began, thousands of black families fled the South for cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York, carrying with them what little they owned and the stories that defined them. Among the quilts, photographs, and Bible pages, the legend of Silas traveled north. In those cold northern cities where new forms of struggle awaited, his myth adapted once more. He became the symbol of endurance, of dignity that could not be taken. In factory tenements and church basements, elders told the young, "You don't need to shout to be strong." Silas didn't. Writers began to find him again, hidden in the folds of oral history. In 1935, a journalist named Langford Hill published an essay in the Chicago Defender titled "The Man Who Never Spoke." He described meeting old freedmen who still kept a carved wooden charm shaped like the symbol, the circle and slash. They said it protected them from cruelty. They said it reminded them that silence could carry power when the world tried to take your voice. When the civil rights movement began to stir decades later, Silas's name returned once again, not in sermons or songs this time, but in the quiet strategies of those who believed change could come through steady courage. In Montgomery, Alabama, during the bus boycotts, a preacher told his congregation, "Brothers and sisters, we walk quiet, but we walk strong, just like Silas." The story had changed with the generations. Some said Silas was a soldier who escaped and joined the Union Army. Others said he was a spirit sent by God. But in every version, he was the same, the embodiment of patience and retribution, of quiet strength that bends the arc of history. In 1958, a young historian named Dr. Samuel Hightower, whose great-grandmother had been born enslaved, began tracing the legend. He spent years traveling across the South, interviewing elders, recording their memories. Many spoke of Silas as if he had been alive only yesterday. Dr. Hightower's notebooks described one encounter that stayed with him all his life. He met a woman in her 90s named Martha Lee in a rural corner of Alabama. She lived alone in a weathered house surrounded by magnolias. When he asked if she knew the story of Silas the Silent, she smiled faintly and pointed to a wooden beam above her door. Carved into it was the symbol, the same circle and slash that had appeared a century earlier. "My daddy carved that," she said. Said his granddaddy saw Silas once, saw him walking down the road in the fog, head high, not afraid. He said Silas didn't speak, but when he passed, the air went still. Said the birds stopped singing, even the dogs stopped barking. Like the world knew him. Dr. Hightower asked her if she believed the story. She chuckled softly. "Belief ain't the point, son. The point is, every generation needs a Silas." That line became the title of his book, Every Generation Needs a Silas. Published in 1963, it became one of the first academic works to explore how oral folklore of resistance shaped the spirit of survival among African Americans. The book spoke not of vengeance, but of endurance, of how a man's silence could echo louder than the shouts of tyrants. As the civil rights movement surged, Silas's name appeared in murals, poems, even songs. Folk singer Mary Louise Clay wrote a haunting ballad titled The Silent Man, her voice trembling like wind through cotton fields. He never spoke, he never ran, but his footsteps thundered like a gun. Through the chains and through the shame, the Silent One still walks the flame. By the 1970s, Silas had become not just legend but legacy. College students studying African American history found his story referenced in lectures on folklore, psychology, and rebellion. For some, he represented suppressed anger turned into patience. For others, he was the embodiment of strategic resistance, the art of waiting until the world was ready to hear your truth. Yet as generations changed, the story began to fade from the mainstream. The modern world, loud and impatient, left little room for silence. The era of shouting slogans replaced the era of whispered strength, but among the elders, those who still remembered the sound of the wind through the old fields, Silas's presence lingered. One such elder was a man named Reverend Alphonse Griggs, a direct descendant of Aaron Griggs, the man who had once stood before the mob and spoken Silas's name. In 1987, Reverend Griggs led a small congregation in Birmingham. Every Sunday he ended his sermon with the same words: "Silence is not surrender. It's preparation." He told his parishioners that sometimes the world listens best to the things unsaid, to the dignity and restraint, to the strength in calm. That, he said, is what Silas taught us. And yet, even in the quiet corners of faith and folklore, mystery still surrounded the man. Who had Silas really been? Was there truly one man who had walked the path of vengeance and vanished into the fog? Or had time taken the pain of thousands and given it one name to carry? In the late 1990s, a discovery rekindled curiosity. During restoration of an abandoned plantation house in Louisiana, workers uncovered a small iron box hidden behind a crumbling fireplace. Inside were rusted tools, a torn piece of leather, and a fragment of parchment with markings, faint but visible. A circle crossed by a line. Beneath it, one word barely legible: Silas. Historians debated endlessly. Some called it forgery. Others called it confirmation. But what mattered most was what followed. Across social media, art, and classrooms, young black creators began reviving the myth. Painters reimagined Silas as a faceless guardian walking through fog. Filmmakers spoke of turning his story into documentaries and dramas. Poets filled open mics with verses about the power of silence. In the 21st century, Silas was no longer just a ghost of the past. He was a symbol of memory itself. A reminder that history isn't always written by those who speak loudest, but often by those who endure longest. Through every retelling, one truth stayed constant. Silas's silence was never weakness. It was defiance in its purest form. And as long as there were people willing to carry that silence, to remember, to endure, to wait for justice when the world turned away, Silas would never truly disappear. For somewhere, in the wind that moves through the trees of the Old South, there is still a sound that is not quite silence, a low, steady hum that feels like breath, like presence, like history remembering itself. The echo of his name, the whisper that never fades, the story that belongs to everyone who was ever told to stay silent. By the dawn of the 21st century, the world had changed beyond recognition, yet the ghosts of the past still walked quietly among its noise. The fields that once bore cotton now carried concrete highways. The shouts of overseers were long gone, replaced by the distant hum of engines and the glow of streetlights. But for those who listened closely, truly listened, the Old South still breathed beneath it all. And in that breath lived Silas. It began with a film student from Atlanta, Naomi Griggs, great-great-granddaughter of Reverend Alphonse Griggs. In 2019, while sorting through her grandmother's attic, Naomi discovered a weathered journal bound in cracked brown leather. On its first page, written in faint ink, were 7 words: "I walk like Silas. I do not speak." It was her ancestor's writing. Aaron Griggs, 1912. Inside were sketches, fragments of songs, and stories passed down through generations. Every page spoke of Silas not as a ghost, but as a principle, a way of surviving when the world refused to hear you. Naomi was mesmerized. She turned that discovery into her film thesis, The Silent March, a documentary tracing the myth of Silas through 200 years of Black resilience. It was a collage of memories, oral histories, and faded photographs. Her narration, soft, steady, deliberate, guided viewers through the echoes of the past. Some say he never existed. Some say he walks among us still. But maybe Silas was never one man at all. Maybe he was the voice inside every man who couldn't speak, and still chose to stand. The documentary premiered quietly at an independent film festival. It didn't win an award, but it did something greater. It started a movement. Viewers across the country began sharing stories of their own Silases, relatives, ancestors, friends, people who had suffered in silence but lived with dignity. Artists painted murals of a shadowed figure walking through fog, the circle and slash symbol glowing faintly behind him. Musicians composed ambient soundscapes built from whispers, footsteps, and the low hum of wind through trees, the sound of silence. They called it, not in sadness, but in reverence. Soon, the symbol of Silas began appearing on social media, on t-shirts, even tattooed on skin, not as fashion, but as identity. It meant, I carry the silence that remembers. It meant, I endure. Universities began teaching the Silent March in African American Studies courses, pairing it with Dr. Samuel Hightower's 1963 classic, Every Generation Needs a Silas. Historians debated whether Silas had truly existed, whether the man was fact, fiction, or collective memory. But even they agreed, myths have their own kind of truth, because sometimes belief builds reality. In 2023, Naomi received an invitation from a preservation group in Louisiana. They had discovered something during a restoration project. The same plantation where, according to Folklore, Silas had once lived. Beneath the ruins of an outbuilding, workers uncovered a narrow brick tunnel leading to a small underground chamber. Inside, they found what time had tried to erase, a stone slab, marked with that same ancient symbol, the circle and the line. But this time, beneath the symbol, there were words etched deep into the stone, for those who were never heard. Naomi stood there in silence. Cameras off. Wind howling softly through the cracked earth. She ran her fingers across the carving, the grooves rough, ancient, deliberate. She didn't know if Silas himself had written it or someone who remembered him. But in that moment it didn't matter, because this was his legacy, not a ghost, not a man, but an idea that refused to die. The final scene of Naomi's film showed her walking away from that burial ground as dawn broke. The sun spilled across the fields, and the screen faded to black. Her voice, soft and resolute, carried over the silence. We live in an age that demands noise, but once, long ago, one man taught us that silence could roar louder than chains and last longer than time. The film went viral months later, not because of fame, but because of timing. The world was divided, restless, shouting at itself from every corner. Amid all the chaos, the Silent March felt like a whisper that stopped people cold. It reminded them that strength doesn't always need a voice, that justice sometimes begins in quiet defiance. And so, 2 centuries after the world tried to erase him, Silas the Silent walked once more, not in body, but in the minds and hearts of those who still carried his silence. He walked in the protesters who marched without shouting. He walked in the writers who told the stories no one wanted to hear. He walked in every person who endured cruelty but refused to surrender their humanity. For silence, when born from pain, becomes something sacred. It becomes the pause between generations, the space where history breathes. And if you stand still on a quiet southern road, where the wind moves low and slow through the pines, you might still feel it, a weight in the air, a presence, a story too strong to vanish, a man who never spoke, yet changed the sound of time itself, Silas the Silent, the echo that became eternity. If you love the darkness, stay with us. Subscribe before the lights go out.